Hello, class, and welcome back to the second part of our lecture on cytoarchitecture and brain function. So as we delve into how cytoarchitecture, the study of the cellular structure of the brain, contributes to specific brain functions, let's first look at how we understand the organization of neurons and their connections and why it's vital to unraveling the mysteries of cognition and emotion and behavior. So, one of the key principles in neuroscience is the concept of localization of function. And this principle suggests that different brain regions are responsible for specific functions and behavior. And so cytoarchitecture plays a critical role that we found in identifying these specialized regions and understanding their unique cellular composition. For example, the cerebral cortex, that outermost layer of the brain, exhibits distinct architectonic patterns in different areas, which means that there's different structures, different ways that the neurons are organized, different types of neurons, and how they relate to each other based upon the function in that specific part of the cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, for example, is responsible for executive functions like decision-making and planning, and it has a different cellular organization compared to, say, the sensory or motor areas of the brain. And Corbinian Brodmann, who was a German neurologist, really contributed significantly to our understanding of cytoarchitecture and brain function. And he divided the cerebral cortex into distinct areas based on cellular differences. And these divisions, known as Brodmann's areas, have been instrumental in localizing various functions. So oftentimes, if you look at enough gross neuroanatomy images of the brain, what you will find is that there are different numbers on those. Those are what are known as Brodmann numbers, Brodmann areas, based upon his classification of the cytoarchitecture, the way that the neurons are organized and relate to each other. So, for example, Brodmann's area 17, for instance, is often associated with the primary visual processing, while Brodmann's area 44 has implications for language production. Now, the study of cytoarchitecture has also shed light on neurological and psychiatric disorders. So researchers have identified differences in the cellular composition of certain brain regions in individuals with conditions like Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia and autism. And these findings have led to a better understanding of the neural underpinnings of these disorders and have opened up avenues for potential treatments and interventions. So it provides a wide range of possibilities for treatment and understanding of different dysfunctions of the brain. And thankfully, our technology is getting to the point where we have very advanced brain imaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI, which have allowed researchers to correlate brain function with psychoarchitectonic maps. And by combining the structural and functional information, we can really gain some clear insights into how specific brain regions contribute to various cognitive processes. For example, fMRI studies have revealed that the amygdala, which, as we probably know, is a region with a distinct cytoarchitecture, plays a key role in processing emotions, and particularly in fear responses. And by studying the cellular architecture of the brain and how it relates to function, we can begin to unravel the intricate web of connections that give rise to our thoughts and emotions and behaviors. And this knowledge not only enhances our understanding of the healthy brain, but also offers insights into the origins and potential treatments of brain disorders. Now I want to kind of zoom in a little bit and just consider a specific portion of our brain. So we're going to just talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex to examine its crucial functions and what makes its cytoarchitecture unique. The prefrontal cortex, located obviously in the front of the brain, plays a pivotal role in higher cognitive functions and executive control. And so the prefrontal cortex, we can kind of think of that as our executive center because it's responsible for a wide range of complex processes. For example, we can think in terms of the primary function being executive function. So there's a region that is crucial for high-level cognitive functions such as planning and decision-making and goal setting and problem solving. And so this region helps us to organize our thoughts and actions to achieve desired outcomes. Then we have our working memory, and the prefrontal cortex is also involved in our working memory, which allows us to temporarily hold certain amounts of information and to manipulate that information. So this is essential for tasks like mental math and can help us with following things like complex instructions. There's also a place in the frontal lobe that is involved in the regulation of emotions and inhibiting impulsive responses. And so damage to this area can result in difficulties in emotional control and impulsivity. And then, of course, there's social cognition, and the prefrontal cortex is involved in understanding the thoughts, intentions, and emotions of others and contributing to the social interactions that we have with others and the empathy that we have for others. So it's also linked to our sense of self, our personality traits, and the ability to monitor and adapt our behavior in different social contexts. And so the unique cytoarchitecture of the prefrontal cortex has a real remarkable complexity in its role in high-level cognitive functioning. And here's some key features of the cytoarchitecture of the prefrontal cortex. First off, neurons in the prefrontal cortex have highly branched dendrites, which receive input from a wide array of other brain regions. And this extensive connectivity allows for the integration of information from various sources, and this helps facilitate complex decision-making. The prefrontal cortex also exhibits a layered structure with distinct layers of cells that are involved in different aspects of information processing. And so these layers play a role in the flow of information within the context. There's also a frontal parietal networks that are formed in there. So the prefrontal cortex forms these intricate networks with other brain regions, particularly the parietal network, the parietal cortex. And these networks really are crucial for tasks that are going to require things like attention and working memory and, of course, goal-directed behavior. And the prefrontal cortex really displays a high degree of plasticity, allowing it to adapt and rewire in responses to learning and experience. And this plasticity underlies our ability to improve executive functions through practice and training. So understanding the unique cytoarchitecture of any part of the brain really helps us to understand its function, like the prefrontal cortex, and the intricate ways that the cytoarchitecture works helps us to understand and identify different areas of higher order cognition and executive control. And, this can go a long ways to help us devise treatments for things like regulation of emotions and social cognition. and how we can engage with others and our thoughts and behaviors and interaction with those in the world with us. So let's go on now and talk a little bit about neurotransmitters, because cytoarchitecture is important, but really neurotransmitters are absolutely essential. So we'll explore now the fascinating world of neurotransmitters, and but it's still just going to be kind of touching on some main ones. There are many different types of neurotransmitters, and some of them have multiple functions. So just be mindful of that, but we're going to look at some of the big ones here. What is a neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter is essentially a chemical messenger that plays a pivotal role in communication within the brain and throughout the nervous system. So understanding these neurotransmitters is really essential for grasping how the brain influences our thoughts and emotions and behaviors. So neurotransmitters, remember, are chemicals that transmit signals from one neuron to another across the synapse, that little tiny gap between the neurons. And these chemicals are involved in a wide range of physiological processes, from regulating mood and sleep to controlling movement and sensation. So here are some basic neurotransmitters and their primary functions. Serotonin. Serotonin is always a big one. It's often referred to as the feel-good neurotransmitter because its role is regulating mood, happiness, and well-being. And so an imbalance of serotonin levels have been linked to conditions like depression, anxiety, and mood disorders. Now, I want to clarify that just a little bit. What serotonin actually does is tell us we're safe, that we don't need to worry so much. And it also plays multiple roles, not only in our blood, but in our lower intestines. Because when you feel safe, that communicates with your heart and your vascular system, so they can relax a little bit. And if you're safe, then you have time to digest your food. So all of this kind of ties together. And so serotonin is absolutely important. If you don't have serotonin or have low levels of serotonin, then you have digestive issues, you have cardiovascular issues, and you feel anxious. And if you're overwhelmed with anxiety, then you feel depression. Next one, dopamine. Dopamine is associated with pleasure and reward and motivation and the experience of satisfaction. Now, who doesn't want to feel rewards and pleasure? So dopamine also is going to play a role in addiction, as substances like drugs and alcohol can lead to increased dopamine release. And it can also have, because there's an intricate balance, you don't want too much dopamine, you don't want too little dopamine, it can cause some serious problems with health and with mental health. So dopamine dysregulation has been implicated, for example, in conditions like Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. In the case of Parkinson's disease, what ends up happening is because Parkinson's isn't just about feeling and emotion, but also about motor control. See, just like all neurotransmitters, there's many different functions it has. So you get loss of smooth motor control when you have too little dopamine. And when you have too much dopamine, in some people, it can lead to schizophrenia. So auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, loss of touch with reality in some cases. And so dopamine plays many, many roles. Then acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter crucial for learning and memory and motor control. And so you can think in terms of Alzheimer's disease. It's characterized by a decrease in acetylcholine levels, leading to a cognitive decline. Now, there's more than that going on, obviously, with Alzheimer's, because there's also neuronal death that takes place both in Parkinson's disease and in Alzheimer's. But just kind of be mindful that that's another neurotransmitter that's very important. Then there is gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that helps calm neural activity. And so this promotes relaxation and reducing anxiety. So some anti-anxiety medications work by enhancing the GABA effects. Then there's glutamate, and glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. So it facilitates the transmission of signals between neurons, and it obviously is going to play a role in learning and memory and overall cognitive functioning. But again, you need to have the correct balance of glutamate. You don't want too much glutamate, you don't want too little. Too little, you're unconscious. Too much, and it can lead to neurological disorders, including things like epilepsy. Then there is norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. And noradrenaline is involved in your fight and flight responses, so increasing alertness and focus and energy during stressful situations. So it plays a role in mood regulation and arousal. Okay? So it's useful, but you don't want it all the time, because that can be very detrimental to the health of your nervous system. And then you can think in terms of endorphins. Endorphins are like the natural painkillers produced by the brain, and they provide a sense of well-being and can even create that runner's high during exercise. And they help alleviate pain and also give you a sense of euphoria. And so understanding these neurotransmitters and their function is really kind of essential, primarily because an imbalance or dysregulation in the levels can contribute to various neurological and psychiatric conditions. And so a lot of medications and therapies are really aimed at restoring the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. And so these are often used to treat conditions like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia. Now, the thing is that you can't just give somebody serotonin. That's not going to work for this particular reason. There's a critical concept in neuroscience and medicine called the blood-brain barrier. And understanding this protective barrier is essential to grasp why certain treatments for conditions like depression must be approached differently than a lot of other illnesses. So the blood-brain barrier is a highly selective and semi-permeable barrier that separates the blood circulation from the brain and central nervous system. And it is composed of some very specialized cells and structures that tightly regulate what substances can enter the brain tissue and what stays out. And it's there to protect the brain. And so this barrier is vital for protecting that very delicate neural environment from harmful substances and from pathogens in the bloodstream. Now, when it comes to things like treating depression, one of the primary targets is the neurotransmitter serotonin. And serotonin plays a crucial role in regulating mood, and many antidepressant medications aim to increase serotonin in the brain. However, there's a significant challenge when it comes to delivering medications that affect brain chemistry because of that blood-brain barrier. And because the blood-brain barrier's primary function is to limit the entry of substances into the brain, this includes drugs and medications. So while this is essential for protecting the brain, it can make it challenging to deliver drugs that need to act on the brain directly. So in this case of depression, many traditional antidepressants aim to increase serotonin levels in the brain by a specific mechanism. And these medications are often known as SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that work by blocking the breakdown of serotonin in the synapses, so the reuptake of the serotonin. And so because the serotonin floats around there longer, it eventually builds up to a higher level. And so this effectively increases the serotonin's availability for transmission. So you effectively have more serotonin in the synapses because it blocks some of the reuptake. However, the blood-brain barrier can limit the entry of these medications into the brain, which may reduce their effectiveness. So SSRIs primarily act in the bloodstream, and so they inhibit the reuptake of serotonin from the synapses. And while the concentration of serotonin in the bloodstream increases, only a small portion of it may reach the brain. But that's enough, usually. And so the blood-brain barrier is a blessing, but it also makes the treatment via medications for neurotransmitters very, very difficult. And so a lot of the research isn't necessarily about understanding the neurotransmitters, because we understand them reasonably well. It's how can we cross that blood-brain barrier effectively with the medications in order to treat the disorder effectively. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, I want to just kind of close out our lecture by recapping some key terms and some essential concepts that we've looked at here so that you feel prepared for when we come into the next quiz. So let's think in terms of neurons. What are neurons? Neurons are the fundamental building blocks of the nervous system. They are responsible for transmitting information through electrical and chemical signals. What is neuroplasticity? Well, that's the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize and change in response to learning and experience and, of course, injury. What is cytoarchitecture? Well, that is the microscopic study of the brain tissue to identify distinct cellular patterns and structures within the brain. What is the prefrontal cortex? Well, that is the brain region located in the front of the brain responsible for executive functions, working memory, emotional regulation, and social cognition. What is neurotransmitters? Well, we know that are the chemical messengers that transmit signals between the neurons, influencing things like mood and behavior and other physiological processes. And, of course, the blood-brain barrier is that protective barrier that regulates the passage of substances between the bloodstream and brain tissue. So, as we close out our lecture today, I want to just kind of review a little bit of what we've covered. What did we do? We looked at considering how the brain is the epicenter of our thoughts and emotions and behaviors. We paid some tribute to Santiago Cajal, who was a pioneer in neuroscience and contributed to our understanding of neurons and the structure of the nervous system. We explored different types of neurons, including sensory neurons and motor neurons and interneurons and mirror neurons, and how each has a unique role in information processing and in behavior. We looked at neuroplasticity. We delved into that whole concept of the brain's limited ability to adapt and rewire itself in response to things like learning and experience. we explored cytoarchitecture and the historical development of cytoarchitecture and its importance in understanding how different brain regions are organized and interconnected. And of course, how cytoarchitecture plays a role in our brain function, how there's localized areas of brain function, and how the cytoarchitecture is really designed to optimize the specific functions in each part of the brain. We also explored neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, norepinephrine, and of course endorphins, and how they regulate mood and motivation and memory and so much more. And we examined the blood-brain barriers and its protective role in limiting the entry of substances into the brain, and discussed how it poses challenges in treating conditions like depression that involve neurotransmitters. And so as we continue our journey within this course, I hope that you really appreciate all the wonderful parts of who you are, from the remarkable adaptability of your brain to the very subtle, localized neural architecture that makes up who you are as an individual. Hope you enjoyed our lecture for today, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.